We're here to bring a new type of news show.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Bringing news just for you. It's Monday, December 22nd here in Seoul. I'm Lee Soo-jin, and this is News Generation. Joining us today is Niall.
Good morning.
Good morning. Also Fabulous with us.
Happy Monday.
Happy Monday. And both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. So it's Monday, the start of a brand new work week, but for many here in South Korea, the conversation this morning isn't just about schedules or deadlines. Instead, a growing sense of concern is shaping public debate as questions about justice and accountability return to the forefront. And at the heart of that discussion is a renewed debate over juvenile crime, especially when a public figure is involved. So Niall, can you tell us about the recent incident that reignited public debate about juvenile offenders here in Korea?
Right. Recently, controversy arose after it was reported that a famous Korean actor had been a juvenile offender in the past. The actor ultimately announced their retirement, but this has sparked some debate, with one side arguing that being a minor cannot excuse the seriousness of the crime, while the other insists that juvenile offenders should be given opportunities for rehabilitation as well as reintegration into society.
So this was all of the news in recent weeks. Have you heard about this as well?
Yes, I did. And because of this controversy in Korea, many are calling for reforms on the Korea Juvenile Act, and those concerns are becoming louder and louder. In Korea, a juvenile offender is someone who is under 19 years old, and those under 14 are called 촉법 소년, which are these people who are exempt from criminal punishment, but at the same time they are placed under protective measures. One side argues that the label juvenile should not excuse behavior like robbery or sexual assault, and the other insists that even young people that are involved in this crime situations should also be given the chance of rehabilitation and also reintegration into society. So this case has shocked many because of how severe the accusations were, and so that also fueled a lot of distrust towards the current juvenile system, with many pointing out that the juvenile cases usually have less strict rules and standards of evidence than the adult trials, and that can become a problem during adulthood when those situations arise to the public's knowledge, especially when the perpetrator is a public image.
So the attention that this case got really shows how one high-profile case can expose deeper tensions in the system, not just about the punishment, but about how trust and how juvenile cases are handled in the first place. So we're going to talk more about this, but first, let's take a look at the screen. The recent revelation that a Korean celebrity had a past record as a juvenile offender has taken the country by storm. This story has dominated headlines and social media not only because of the individual involved, but because it has reopened broader questions about juvenile crime and accountability, especially if the person at the center of the controversy is a public figure. So today on News Generation, we take a closer look at the sharply divided opinions on how juvenile offenders should be viewed, how similar cases involving celebrities abroad have been addressed, and how the broader social discussion on juvenile crime should move forward. So as we just saw in the video, this case has reignited a broader debate about how juvenile offenders should be judged later in life, especially when they become public figures. So what stands out in this case that we talked about in our intro is the intensity of the public reaction. So the seriousness of the crimes combined with the fact that the individual is a public figure has pushed many to ask where society should draw the line. So now, where do opinions diverge most sharply when it comes to how juvenile offenders should be treated in cases like this?
Yes, in this case, because the charges involved very serious crimes, we won't go into the specific offenses. Many people believe that the retirement actually came a little bit too late. They argue that the crime is too severe to be excused as mere immaturity and that stricter standards should be applied to public figures. From the victim's perspective, seeing the person who committed something so horrific against them receive public love constitutes perhaps secondary harm.
Right, but at the same time, not everyone agrees that past wrongdoing should permanently define a person. So, Fabi, what is the counter argument to this, to holding someone's juvenile record years later?
Well, some do argue that blocking someone's acting career for something that happened more than 30 years ago is probably an excessive stigmatization. And at the same time, the legal process was already solved at the time when that happened through the juvenile system. They emphasize that the core purpose of the protection for juveniles here in Korea is not punishment but rehabilitation. And because of that, the law is designed for these people to adjust to a new environment and also kind of like change their behavior. And it clearly states that this protective measures should not affect someone's future, which is what is happening right now, which is why some people are a little bit against the idea of what's going on. From this perspective, someone who did not remain trapped in these problems of the past and has been working over decades to kind of build that social respect and their own career could be seen as a probably like successful case of this rehabilitation. But at the same time, going against that could undermine the possibility of repentance at the same time. So there is a very deep debate and this tension between those that argue that someone does have the power of like changing their lives, while other people do argue that accountability should remain tangible at this moment too.
So obviously another reason why this case received so much attention was because of this profession of who was involved, like the celebrity.
Yes.
So when someone's career depends on public trust and admiration, expectations tend to be very different from those applying to ordinary citizens. So now how is the fact that this individual is a celebrity intensifying the controversy?
I mean, in many different cases we've seen in the Korean entertainment industry, fandoms are increasingly acting not just as consumers, but as almost watchdogs. And as a result, entertainers' ethical conduct and private lives are being scrutinized and perhaps criticized a lot more strictly than before. In fact, activities of entertainers accused of school violence or sexual violence have been halted after victims spoke out. Experts analyze that this trend reflects a social sensitivity that demands higher responsibility from professions that gain wealth and fame through public support.
And we see this not just in Korea, but also abroad as well. Some celebrities get scrutinized for their lyrics as well, for being not appropriate. We see that everywhere. But other countries have taken a bit of a different approach to similar situations, especially when it comes to public figures. So are there well-known examples in Hollywood or other countries where stars were able to continue their careers despite these past offenses?
Well, overseas, especially in Western countries, we all know the cancel culture. But at the same time, it is true that the redemption arc can be enough to justify this type of juvenile and criminal cases that have happened in the past and can be forgotten by the audience. For example, actor Robert Downey Jr., who is very famous for playing Iron Man in the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse, rebuilt his career after repeated arrests through rehabilitation. And actor Mark Wahlberg also facing this violent juvenile offense cases, did build a major starred Hollywood career after having these problems in his early years. So because of that, this tolerance does clearly have limits, but some people are able to forget as long as that artist is able to build that reputation. But when it comes, for example, to sexual violence, I do think that people tend to be more strict overseas too. And that is why media coverage is usually bigger for issues like sexual crimes because of movements and initiatives like the Me Too movement. In contrast, however, Japan does have a more strict approach and a one-strike out type of movement when it comes to this criminal offenses, where artists can be instantly take out of their careers because of what they did. Korea does have a similar public sentiment to Japan, and this growing expectations of fairness and social justice and responsibility in a social context do have a result in the end. So past crime allegations for celebrities can become a tough issue and an erasable scar for many of them.
It's interesting to see how much culture plays a role in this. Like you mentioned, I feel like in Western culture, sexual crimes tend to be dealt with more severely than it is in Korea, but it's quite different. So that comparison really also highlights how cultural expectations shape justice beyond the courtroom, especially when fame and public trust are involved. So for more on this, we're going to talk to a legal expert, and that conversation will take place right after the break, so don't go anywhere.
NewsGen wants to hear from you. Go to YouTube and search out Channel Arirang News. Click Posts and cast your vote in the poll. Make a new type of news with us.
Joining us today is Kim Ji-soo, a licensed lawyer here in Korea. Hello, thank you so much for connecting with us today.
Good morning.
For having me.
So for those who believe accountability should take priority, has this case reignited calls to revise South Korea's juvenile law?
So definitely this case has clearly reopened the debate of the juvenile system. And recently, the difference is that the people in the past, people only talked about lowering the age of punishment or maybe harshening the punishment itself. However, the difference is that the question has shifted to whether we should disclosure the juvenile records of the past. And recently, a lawmaker, Nak Kyung-won from People Power Party, has proposed a bill regarding to allow disclosures of the juvenile victims if one is related to high official standards. So it would, we would see that this proposal will soften the previous rule of disclosing the whole juvenile criminal records. And probably this whole social movement definitely shows that there is a great demand for greater accountability in regarding the crime, even if it was happened in the past juvenile years.
Right, and perhaps what they're trying to say that being able to get the records out from the past goes against this, but supporters of a more lenient approach often point out that the original purpose of the juvenile justice system is for rehabilitation. So from a legal standpoint, how do you view that argument?
So as a lawyer, I would definitely support the original purpose of the juvenile system. So before we delve into the question itself, I would like to elaborate a bit about what's the original purpose of this whole juvenile system. Why do we not disclosure their past records? So the basic symptoms we have, thesis we have underlying this basement of this system is that children can be changed, and they are very vulnerable creatures, especially in the criminal aspects. So we should definitely give them a room for rehabilitation, a second chance for them to grow and become one of the became a great example to be a part of our social norm. However, I think the problem is that when victims disappear from this debate. So if we only talk about protecting the offenders, victims might feel ignored, and that weakens the public trust on the juvenile system that we have. So legally, protection for juvenile system cannot definitely come before the victim's rights. So leniency definitely must have conditions before we discuss about it. For example, real responsibility for the offenders and clear care for the victims. So and that balance will definitely we will secure the juvenile system to be part of our whole social norm.
We are seeing with school violence cases that sometimes a student's past behavior can affect their admission to college. So does this raise concern for fairness when similar standards are not held for current juvenile crimes?
So definitely fairness has raised a concern regarding the unfairness ground between the school violence records and the juvenile records, because in Korea, school violence records affect college admissions. However, serious juvenile crime records are being disclosed, and even like robberies or homicides are not affecting the college admission itself. So many lawmakers are also making a simple question. So is this fair? I think the problem has happened since the Ministry of Education has implemented this system without regarding a proper coordination with the Ministry of Justice. So as a result, school violence seems to be punished more harshly than some serious juvenile systems. And in a legal aspects, if school violence affects the college admission itself, then judicial decisions such as a suspended sentences or higher should at least be discussed, even for the juvenile crime records.
Right. Thank you so much for clearing that up for us today and joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we just heard from a lawyer about the legal framework surrounding juvenile offenders and her legal take on the differing views surrounding juvenile crimes. Now I want to ask you, Niall, about your thoughts on this. Do you believe juvenile offenders can truly change for the better?
Wow, it's such a loaded question. And after that interview, it really is thought-provoking. But I think the issue is generalizing. We cannot guarantee that every juvenile offender can be successfully rehabilitated. But at the same time, we can't classify them all as permanent criminals, as earlier mentioned, that it's sometimes they need the right environment to change and to be rehabilitated. And I believe that the right type of rehabilitation is only possible when there's full emotional and psychological penitence, and not just the punishment for the sake of causing pain for these children and the minors. And so in some ways, yes, there are hopes, but I do think that there needs to be proper support for that rehabilitation to happen.
I think there's so many layers to this question. So what are your thoughts on this, Gabriel?
I also do believe in rehabilitation, but at the same time, I do think that in that process, sometimes a framework that is a little bit more strict or that creates that sense of accountability might be needed. For example, when we look at school violence, we are seeing how these cases where students might be denied access to some elite universities, we are seeing a direct effect on their actions. So that's probably going to motivate those kids to have better behavior. It's going to encourage them to be a little bit more respectful during school, even though they are probably not in an age where they are responsible enough to be completely accountable, held accountable for their actions. But if that system kind of motivates them to act the correct way, I do think that that punishment framework might be helpful in rehabilitating them for their behavior.
I think there's so much I'm still processing basically what Chisu said about how technically, if a student commits like homicide and they're young, then it might not affect their college admissions, whereas like school violent crimes do. So there's so many things to think about here. So it's quite clear that it's not easy to build a system that feels fair to victims, credible to the public, and still constructive for young offenders. So we wanted to find out what you thought too. So we asked on the Arirang News YouTube channel, what is your opinion on people with a history of juvenile delinquency? So here's what the results showed. So the clear majority, 70% of respondents believe juvenile offenders can change, while 22% think they cannot. The remaining 8% expressed other opinions or were undecided. So the poll results are actually quite striking. A clear majority still believes juvenile offenders can change, yet a significant minority remains skeptical about this. So this divide highlights just how complex the conversation around juvenile crime has become. So it's not just about individual cases. It raises broader questions about how society approaches these issues as a whole. So to wrap up our discussion for today, Niall, so what kind of discussion should there be about juvenile offenders?
I think first and foremost, we need to have an honest, mature discussion about why this is not culturally accepted for people in Korea to go on to have a career in the eyes of the public after having some past with the juvenile delinquency. And I think for higher moral standards for celebrities and public figures, to what extent is it for us personally, is it fair as a society, or how much of it is actually personal judgment and sometimes emotional dumping that we justify?
And also, there's also the victim's position to think about as well, so it's really complicated. Do you have anything to add to this?
I'm going to bring this again to the school environment. Being a student myself too, I have seen a lot of young kids engaging in criminal behavior or taking some choices that might be a little bit risky for their lives. And most of the time at that age, they don't really realize the consequences that those actions are going to have in their future lives. So I do think that a system that properly tells them how to act is kind of necessary. So I do get these skepticism about how protective this Juvenile Act is, because at the same time, even though you're protecting a minor through their actions and understanding them wholeheartedly, at the same time, you're not allowing them to realize how hurtful what they're doing is. So we're talking about homicide, or for example, when we're talking about school bullying, they might become issues when trying to access universities, and if that becomes a limitation, they're probably going to be a little bit more wary about the situation. And we also need to think about the victims. Those victims that are also probably underage are also going through hard stuff at that moment. And so sometimes we see, for example, school bullying cases where victims are not giving the proper infrastructure to build their own lives and escape that situation, while perpetrators are just left hanging around and kind of like kept private without really like attacking the real issue, which is, you know, giving that kid the proper education for not continuing that type of abuse inside school. So I do think that in these cases, we need to hold people accountable to some extent, but at the same time, to be able to avoid situations like we are having right now with the celebrities, those issues should be kind of like solved during that time, you know, and kind of like make amends to the victims, apologize properly, and have that legal system already set so that once they become adults, they don't have that shadow that is going to, you know, they're going to carry for the rest of their lives with them.
I agree. I think you brought up a really good point about how there needs to be more attention also on how the victims can, you know, recover from what has happened to them as well.
Yes.
I think that's really important too.
I think the protection aspect of the victims you mentioned was excellent, but also at the same time the rehabilitation of the victims as well, because this is such a big traumatic moment for them, going through psychological therapy, counseling to process this probably for the rest of their lives is so necessary in order for all of us to coexist in society, whether they do have a juvenile crime past or they are a victim to one of those crimes as well.
There's a lot of people to consider to make the right system as well. So ultimately, the debate over juvenile crime forces society to confront a very difficult balance between accountability and second chances. So as views remain divided, the question moving forward may not be whether the system should change, but how it can better protect society while giving young people a real opportunity to choose a different path. So that brings us to the end of today's episode of News Generation. But News Gen will be back tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Korea time with more stories and discussions. A big thanks to Niall.
No problem.
And Fabio.
Thank you for having me here.
For joining us today. And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope you have the best day. We are
News Generation.